Hey there everyone, so today I'm going to be talking about a book that I know you've all heard of. It has taken over TikTok and Goodreads, and it has completely taken over the fantasy space recently. The second book just came out. I'm really excited to read it, so I wanted to start off my little YouTube book club by kind of diving into that and everything I think. So let's get into it. I know you guys have all heard of this book. Dun da da da! So this is Fourth Wing by Rebecca Yarros. I hope I'm saying that right. And I know you have all heard of this book. It has been super popular since it came out in May, and I've never really been the kind of person to stay on top of book releases, but this book was recommended to me by like multiple people, so I decided that I had to read it, and I really enjoyed it. So the author of this book, she is new to the fantasy space. From my understanding, this is her very first fantasy work, which is pretty impressive, but she is not new to the romance genre. She's written other romance books in the past, which I feel like if you've read this book, you can definitely tell that the romance and kind of that tension that builds up in a lot of different parts of the book is really prevalent. So I really enjoyed that part of it. If you're not expecting a fantasy romance, that's your warning. So just be ready for that if you haven't read that yet. And for those of you who haven't had the pleasure to read this book yet, we are following Violet. She is the main character as she goes through this war college called Basgiath War College in her home city town of Navarre, which would be, from my understanding, the capital of this country, of this continent that this book takes place. And Violet is attempting to become a dragon rider. This is one of those stories where it follows a very, like many young adult and new adult books, it kind of follows that same kind of trope where you have a girl who's very relatable, you know, she's kind of timid and she's young and she wants to be a part of her society, right? In this case, it would be a scribe. She wants to be a scribe. But instead of getting to do that part of her adult life that she wants, she's pushed towards the aspect of her society, of her faction, or of her, in this case, in Basgiath War College, she is going to become a dragon rider. And again, there's different reasons in every storyline why our young adult woman doesn't get to choose the path that she wants, but she ends up in the really action-packed section of the world that she didn't intend to be in. In Fourth Wing, Violet is sent to become a dragon rider, which is known for a really high amount of deaths. A lot of people die trying to become a dragon rider, trying to bond with a dragon, and so it's meant to be this really intense, it's meant to evoke a lot of action-packed and high intense scenes, which is really good. And it's really fun to read books that have this foundation that's made for action-packed scenes throughout the book. So that's really entertaining. One gripe I've heard from a number of people talking about this book is that there is a lot of unnecessary death. You know, like we talk about how the author has kind of built up this world where we're at war and we need these people to be dragon riders to help uphold, you know, their defense systems on the borders and all these things. So it seems unnecessary to let your students die in the process. A lot of the trials that they present across the parapet and at the threshing, you have a lot of people who are dying, and it doesn't seem necessary. It's mostly there to just add that tension to the storyline that, you know, Violet or people that she's friends with and people that she cares about could die at any point in the story is really why that's there. And I think it does add that layer of tension that you are worried that these people are gonna die, but it's definitely not a necessary part of the story and is not as complimentary to the world building as it could be. I will say though that fantasy and sci-fi at this point in my life, especially in kind of that new adult genre, is definitely my favorite kind of book to read. I have a lot of books that I've read that follow, again, this similar kind of storyline, and I really enjoy that, whether it's like dystopian kind of sci-fi or you have, again, this young group of people who are, from what I've read, I would assume are going to overthrow the government. We love that. You know, I'm a pretty easily entertained person, so even though I've read similar storylines in other books, I do still enjoy it, and I know that I enjoy it, which is one of the reasons that I like this book. So going more into the story, so you have Violet who's working her way through this war college, you know, trying to become a dragon rider, where you can definitely see very quickly with all of these really intense kind of tasks and stuff that they have to do, you know, sparring each other, someone's always dying. You know, it's meant to be a high adrenaline space for Violet in the beginning of the book, and you can definitely see her growing her confidence really, really quickly and finding certain strengths that she has compared to other people, which really helps excel her through her college experience, right, in this case, which is really fun, and it is very easy to kind of really side with her and understand where she's coming from as the underdog in this situation, which is really fun to read. And I think being able to see her grow was definitely the biggest character development that we've been able to see in this book, which is very cool. And we get to meet other people. Obviously, she has her friends, she has Liam, and she has Rhiannon, and then of course there's tension between her and Dane and her and Xaden, so there is some good relationships going on there, which are fun. Obviously Xaden being her good old enemies to lovers character, so that's good. One thing that was really obvious from the beginning of the book is that Dane is her Gale, right? The first thing I thought of was Peeta and Gale reading this, even though I wouldn't say that Xaden is very much Peeta at all, at least in the first book. I definitely see her and Dane's relationship in this book the same as Katniss and Gale. So I thought that was pretty interesting. That was a pretty obvious thing happening at the beginning of the book where you kind of see the relationship and you have that kind of, like he is really cute and Dane's always been there for me. And from the get-go, you're like, that's not gonna work out. And it's pretty obvious. And I think it's funny as someone, like I've read so many young adult books and I've kind of noticed that I'm finally starting to grow into more complicated books, that this is one of the first books I've read where I've actually noticed that stuff and been like, yeah, there it is, which is really, really funny to me because it's incredibly entertaining. And then you have kind of this like sprinkling of moments where you're like, oh, yep, and there's that trope that I forgot happens in every book that I read. I'm gonna start off, I think, with my biggest critiques of the book. There really aren't many, there's just a couple of things. So the first thing I mentioned was that there's a lot of people who kind of are dying off for whatever reason. You know, it adds some suspense, but it's kind of just there, you know, that's okay, that's whatever. I kind of just accepted it as part of the story, not a big deal. One of my other, hold on, let me find it. One of my other bigger complaints, and I'm gonna preface this by saying that the second book did come out and there is supposedly meant to be 5 books in this series, so there is a lot of development to the story that can happen that I'm really, really excited for, and I really hope I get to see that stuff unfold because I would love to see more of the world being built and more of the politics being built. I think for me the biggest thing that was missing was more politics. And I only say that because she is the daughter of the general of this war college. They're in the middle of a war. They're talking about, you know, Xaden and his friends and this group of, you know, rebels and all this stuff, but they don't, I think the author doesn't really dive into that as much as I would like to see. I'd really like to see more moral dilemmas, you know, more complexity on why we're in the situation that we're in, that we have to be at war, that these people have to die to ride the dragons, that these kids of the rebels have to blah, 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 blah. And I'm really hoping that this first book was more of just scratching the surface so we could get an understanding. And then as we get into the other books, hopefully we'll get to see more detail in that and move away from this kind of, you know, Violet is growing and changing in school to more Violet is growing and changing and is now a part of the war. I think will be a much bigger driving storyline that I'm hoping to see in the following books. So we'll have to talk about that later. The only other nitpicky thing I have was there was just a few too many moments where this enemies to lovers between Violet and Xaden was just a little too like, oh yeah, you know what I mean? Well, of course that would happen, you know, a little bit too predictable for me. And it was still incredibly entertaining. I was still in it emotionally 100% beginning to end. And in those really intense scenes, like my heart was still pounding, you know, my emotions were still flared, right? But there were still a couple points where I was like, yep. And there's nothing wrong with that. It just loses just that little edge of suspense, or that little extra sharp emotion that you could feel is just lost when you see it coming. Even though, again, I did completely and shamelessly enjoy it from first to last page. But getting that out of the way, my biggest critiques about the books, I just want to talk more about what I really loved. And I will say I loved this book. I loved it. I've seen a lot of critiques of people saying it's overhyped. I am not on that train. I loved it. I really did. And I'm really, really excited to read the second book as well and see what else is coming. I would say as far as fantasy goes, this was really good. I mean, one great thing about fantasy is that you can't go wrong with dragons, in my opinion. I think it's pretty hard to mess up dragons. It's such a good foundation to build a fantasy series off of. I love dragons. And one of my favorite plot points about this book was you have some of these moments where you're seeing where the story is going, where you're understanding what the author is trying to convey. It makes a lot of sense. It's very straightforward. So the threshing is when all of the students who have made it past those first initial tests get to kind of present themselves in front of the dragons, and the dragons have this superior power to, I mean, essentially kill you. And they are the ones at the end of the day who get to decide if they want to bond with you or not, which I like. I like that they leave the dragons having that superior power in the book. I think that's really cool and brings a different morality to the table compared to, you know, the human government who's trying to wage this war and all this stuff. And I really liked how they did the dragons. And one thing I especially appreciated was there's two dragons who've been brought up, right? So they bring up Tarn, the big, huge, bigger than any other dragon, the black dragon, who hasn't bonded with anyone in forever because his last rider died and almost killed him because of how strong their bond was. And he is mentioned once earlier in the book in a class, and I remember that scene where they're talking about, they have this image of this huge dragon, and they're like, this is the baddest ass dragon of all, but no one can bond with him. And you're thinking to yourself, yeah, Violet's gonna bond with him. You know, you see it, you're like, oh, there it is, there's that hint, I need it, right? Because she's gotta be different and unique than everybody else. So I'm waiting for this moment, and here it is. I was waiting for another moment later on for that to be brought up, but it's not really brought up. So kind of forget about it, kind of slips back, and they start bringing up this other dragon, a Feathertail, which is a dragon that no one else has bonded to. They're smaller and all this stuff. And it starts to sound like these younger dragons are a lot more like Violet. And so I remember, you know, you're starting to think to yourself, oh, like maybe they'll turn this into something instead and she'll bond. And then you have this gold Feathertail dragon that shows up to the threshing. And this is a pivotal moment. From this moment on, I'm convinced. You know, you're like, yep, there it is. Like, obviously this is the unique dragon that they have present in this moment. It's gonna pick her right now. Game over, right? And then something special is gonna happen after that. And what I really enjoyed is after this threshing scene, when they're all walking around, she's defending this golden dragon, you're watching the tension build. And you know, you're like, this is the moment where this gold dragon is going to choose her. Like, you know that this is when they're gonna bond and it's gonna create something special. And then finally they bring back the twist. Tarn comes in, blows everyone away, kills somebody, whatever. And then you have both the gold and the black dragon. I really like how we built up to this because it actually made it a lot more surprising to have kind of these two options of dragons, like both offered as very unique. You have one dragon who's very powerful and you have one dragon who's a lot like our main character. So then suddenly you're thinking, you're like, oh, you're actually not sure who she's gonna end up with. And I really enjoyed that extra suspense because you think, you know, you're like, oh yeah, that makes sense. And then they introduce this other dragon, you're like, oh yeah, that makes sense. But it still manages to surprise you in the end. So I really enjoyed the twist of when Tarn kind of claims that he has bonded with Violet, and then Andarna also steps in to bond with her. I think that was so exciting. I freaked out when I read it, so I'm really happy that that's how that was written. So they meet back with their dragons and they're supposed to announce their dragon's name to say that they bonded, right? And you come back and everyone's amped. Everyone sees Violet riding on the back of this huge dragon, of the most badass dragon, right? This most epic, super cool black dragon has brought her in. And, you know, they've bonded. And so it's supposed to be this epic thing where she walks up to the guy and it says, I lift my chin, Tarn knock. What she says, pronunciation could use some work. If you know how this is supposed to be pronounced, please let me know. And you have this interruption where the gold dragon says Andarna for short. Bum bum bum. This book also has a really fun enemies to lovers, of course, which we see all the time. It's a great way to kind of start off with tension and to really build the tension in the relationship. Rebecca, as a romance author, primarily does that really well, and it's very entertaining, with Xaden being you know, the son of the leader of the rebellion, and then you have Violet, who is the daughter of the general of Navarre. There's obviously almost like a family feud between them, and like you know, they kind of have this war-torn past on either side of this war for both of them, which is really cool to see, and it's another thing that I really hope we get more in depth with in future books. One of my favorite lines that we'll talk about is this one from Xaden earlier on in the book, where he says, "What makes you a writer is what you do after people die. You want to know why you're still alive? Because you're the scale I currently judge myself against every night. Every day I let you live, I get to convince myself that there's still a part of me that's a decent person. So if you want to quit, then please spare me the temptation and quit. But if you want to do something, then do it." I think that's a really, really bold statement, and it's one of the first ever deep things that we actually get to hear Xaden say to Violet, which is huge. And this is a huge, huge part of his character, where he's talking about how her being there is such a challenge for him. And I really hope that instead of blowing past that and just growing their relationship, that actually becomes something that we kind of get to see more and talk about more from him. Because certain aspects of their relationship, while it's really fun to watch the tension kind of ebb and flow and grow and die between the two of them, I think it'll be huge to not let this aspect of Xaden's character building get blown over by the other aspects of romance that have been written. And hopefully we get to know more about Xaden's past and the rebellion's past and get to kind of crack that open a bit. And another character aspect I think is interesting is with Dane, kind of how I was comparing him to Gale earlier. I think it'll be interesting to see if his loyalties change, because towards the end of the book, we kind of have this admittance that Dane betrayed Violet and let her kind of fall into this trap with Xaden. And so I'm interested to see if because they have to meet up again. You know, we're gonna have to address that issue at some point. And so I'm interested to see if I understand Dane as a character, I think he will make excuses for himself a lot if Violet tries to stand up for herself and bring that up to him, that he betrayed her. And I think it'll be interesting to see kind of what side Dane lands on at the end of the day, because I do think that Dane will actually become childhood friend to enemy at the end of the day. And I think he will continue to kind of stick with the Dragon Riders and with Navarre through the whole thing, kind of based on how his character's been in this book. And so I think that'll be another area of kind of this personal fighting, kind of internal fighting that Violet will have to face later on, with Dane being on what I'm assuming will become one of the enemies and one of the bad sides of the story. Compared to other fantasy series, right, this is definitely a heavy fantasy series. I don't know if that's the right term, but if you think about, they have this connection with the dragons where they have like a mental connection, and they also channel magic through them, which is a lot of similarities to Aragon, where Aragon bonds with Saphira and now he's able to use magic. And it's used and written in a unique way where they get different kinds of magic depending on their dragon and depending on their personal self. And then as compared to things like Lord of the Rings or Game of Thrones, where dragons are a lot more independent and they're a lot more beast-like. You know, they're these incredible, powerful beasts that aren't able to be tamed, really. You can see like dragons in those other series are, again, a lot more wild, a lot less anthropomorphic, you might say, as some other fantasy series. So it's always fun to see kind of what way you can go with dragons, because like I said, it's a great foundation to build on. And for our last couple points, I am really excited to see that after you see Violet bond with her dragon, you really start to get more into the war of it all. And the last quarter of the book is a lot of fighting, a lot more talking about getting more in depth with what the war is about. You know, things aren't quite right, so on and so forth. As you get towards the end, you get to see the venom and you get to see the wyvern that have only been brought up here and there. And so you're finally introduced to the greater evil of the whole thing. Finally introduced the grand plot for the series, which isn't just Violet getting through this war college, but it's actually the war against these deeply evil and corrupted beings outside of the borders of Navarre. Another thing that was really well done as we get towards the end of the book, you know, she has been betrayed by Dane, she's been betrayed by Xaden, and we're kind of stuck in this place now where we're seeing the greater evil, which is the Wyvern and the Venom at the end of the book, and they are in this battle. And I think one of the things that was really well done is some of the action in the book so far definitely wasn't perfect, but at the end when you have this battle against, in this city, you know, somewhere far away with the dragons, like real life, like true evil, they're battling, and we see this scene where you have Day and Liam, and it's really detailed on how Liam and his dragon are working really well together in this really intense battle. And I think how this was written leading up to Liam's death was really huge and very emotional. And I definitely think the way that Liam was written going up to this point did make it incredibly painful. And I think it was written really, really well to build up to that. I was completely heartbroken. And I remember as I was reading into that battle scene, I actually stopped reading because I knew something was gonna happen, and I knew I had to come back to it the next day because I could feel it. And I think that's a sign of being able to kind of build up the emotion in that scene really well, because I could predict, like I could tell by the way that the scene was building that something terrible was gonna happen, but you can't really be confident in what. And I think those kinds of scenes and writing in this book is what makes it really good, is there's enough of the moments where you can kind of predict, but you might not be completely correct, and that gives it a lot of tension. And that scene towards the end was incredibly emotional, and I think we were really able to get more emotional and purposeful with what was happening in those last battles and the last couple scenes in the book that sets it up so well for the second book. Huge twist at the end of the book. I know I've given away a lot of spoilers, but just in case you haven't gotten to the very end, the last page absolutely pulled the rug out from under me. I can't believe it. I was so caught up in everything else that was happening that completely got the wool pulled over my eyes. So I'm really excited that the way the twist ending will work into the future books, to be able to see how they play into that, because they can do a lot with how that book ended, and I think it leaves a lot of room for us to be able to expand more into the war that's going on, more into Violet and her family and Xaden's past, and with his parents being people who are part of, you know, the infamous rebellion and everything. So I'm really excited to see that be explained in a lot more detail going forward. I know there's a lot more to talk about. This is a big book. This is a pretty thick book, and I really want to hear what you guys think about it. Any big talking points, I would love to reply to your comments. I'd love to turn this more into a discussion, and I'm hoping to set up more platforms soon so that this can become more of a book club. And so please let me know in the comments other thoughts or things that I missed. There's a couple other things I'm really excited for. So with this series, only the second book only just came out a couple days ago. I have it right here. I'm excited to read it. But they've already signed on for an Amazon Prime TV show for Fourth Wing, which is epic. I think Game of Thrones was an absolute game changer for books to movies and books to TV. So I'm really, really excited for that. Obviously, Amazon has disappointed us in the past with like the Rings of Power and stuff like that, but I'm really not picky, so I'm at least excited to see what they do with it, and I'm really excited to read the rest of this series and kind of see where it goes, and also be able to have a TV show to watch, so that's cool. Again, if you guys enjoyed this video, please subscribe, please. You guys can read along with me if you'd like to. The next book I'm going to be reading is A Court of Thorns and Roses. I know a lot of you have probably already read this. It's incredibly popular and it's been out for a little while, but if you haven't, this is a great opportunity. I'll be releasing my video on this in 2 weeks from today, whenever this comes out. And so stick around if you want to see that. If you've already read this but you want to read along with me, the next video I'll be doing in 4 weeks from now is going to be To Swim in a Sea of Stars by Christopher Paolini, and I'm really excited for that one too. So make sure you guys buy one of these books so you can read it with me. Go ahead and get it from the library, get an audiobook, download it, whatever. I'm really excited to kind of turn this into an ongoing thing where you guys can kind of see what I'm reading and we can kind of talk about it together. I'm hoping to get some more platforms started so that way we can kind of share thoughts as we go. You guys don't necessarily have to wait for the video, but we'll see. Let me know in the comments what you guys think. Don't forget to like and subscribe. And thank you very much for watching. Bye.